Thank you, Sheldon, and thank all of you for coming today. It's lovely to see so many people here, friends, colleagues, ex-colleagues, some ex-students, even my wife, who will find, after 22 years, find out what I actually do for a living, I think, at the end of tonight, which is great. As Sheldon referred to, the whole point of tonight, then, the session is to explore this title, or looking at value flow, and the nature of what value flow is will become apparent, I think, as I go through this presentation. We're going to look at, as I say, the evolution of conventional management theory. There's growing dissatisfaction, or has been growing dissatisfaction with elements of that theory, certainly since the mid-1980s onwards. I'll call the modern production era up to the present time. And we see in that period the growth of what I call comps, or contemporary operations and management paradigms. Things like lean thinking, Six Sigma, theory of constraints, that have impacted management, certainly in this country. And they present themselves as an antidote to some of those dysfunctions. And what we're going to see is basically the common denominator, I would argue, across those comps is the value flow notion. So ultimately what I'll be presenting to you over the next 45 minutes or so is the product of my academic experience over the last 17 years, working with companies like Tesco's, Asda, Sainsbury's, British Airways, etc. And I'll be pleased to announce that at the end of this session, it'll culminate in ultimately the launch of a new centre here at the School of Management called the Value Flow Centre, surprise, surprise. And that will be intended to explore the subject matter of tonight in a bit more breadth and depth. That's going to form its research remit. So that's the plan of action. I find tonight is going to be quite challenging. It's quite a challenging gig, as we say, because it's quite a mixed audience. There are academics and practitioners in the audience. I recognise some great experts in the subject matter, some of whom actually have almost defined the subject matter of tonight, and have certainly influenced my personal thinking. And say we have practitioners and academics. We have questions at the end. I've tried to pitch tonight's session that hopefully everybody will get something out of it, but there's going to be questions and answers at the end of tonight. So if I've not addressed any issues to anybody's satisfaction, we can deal with that. My usual caveat at this stage in the game, you might have noticed already, I speak very quickly. It's a product of being born in Morriston. Quite sadly, I get excitable because this excites me. And my rate of speech could potentially get even faster. So those of you that have idle positions, you have a special role for tonight. If it gets unbearable, please throw yourself in the aisle and pretend to faint. That will catch my attention. I will take that as a sign to slow down a little bit, okay? Okay, so starting, I suppose, with the problem of the causes well, let's explore the evolution of conventional management theory. Conventional management theory, as we understand it today, as is taught in business schools such as this, and is practiced in our organisations, is really the product of a relatively small number of seminal publications and seminal contributions. So, for example, Adam Smith gave us the notion in his magnum opus, it's 1776, The Wealth of Nations. He gave us the notion of the division of labour. I always have to refer to my notes at this point because in the late 1800s, Max Weber gave us the notions of the principles of ideal bureaucracy. And this is where I can never remember what they all are. But building upon Adam Smith's earlier work, he indicated that the ideal bureaucracy has clearly diversified labour and structures in place. He indicates that hierarchical structures are an important feature of a bureaucratic organisation, because he was basing his model on the military models that preceded that. Weber stressed the importance of written guidelines for performance criteria, and he also suggested that we should recruit based upon specialisation and expertise. And what goes hand in glove with that is that authority should be attached to the notion of the position rather than the person. So it's this rejection of nepotism, which was quite prevalent at the time. These are ideas that we take for granted now, but were contributions in their own right in the day. Alfred Sloan, who was the CEO of General Motors from the 20s to the 50s, through works such as The Visible Hand, gave us the notion of management by numbers, or management by objective criteria. Alfred Chandler, who was, I believe, professor of business history at Harvard, gives us the notion of hierarchy and responsibility of control. We see echoes of that in earlier work, but it's actually to Chandler that we can attribute the organisation chart, for instance, which is so prevalent today. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the work of Douglas McGregor and his Theory X and Theory Y assumptions. So McGregor, again, a professor at Stone School of Management, suggested that Theory X assumptions of management are the worker is basically idle, that the worker will shirk responsibility, and that the worker will ultimately need to be coerced in order to increase productivity. As distinct from the Theory Y assumptions of management, this suggests that, actually, your average worker will identify with the organisation and the organisation's problems and is prepared to use his or her own ingenuity to help solve those problems. Very influential in terms of conventional management theory today is the work of F.W. Taylor, Frederick Winslow Taylor. Now, Taylor gave us Taylorism and scientific management, also known as Taylorism. Of Taylor, Peter Drucker, who was the sort of eminent management educationalist, says, and I should quote, he's the first man in recorded history to deem work worthy of systematic observation and study. And Taylor's life work was about increasing labour productivity. Actually, what Taylor did was, he was interested, he did his work was with the Bethlehem Steel Corporation in the late 1800s. And what he was attempting to achieve with his scientific management was to replace rules of thumb with scientific management. And by scientific management, he actually meant time and motion study. So he was looking always to deconstruct work into its constituent components and find the one best way of undertaking that piece of work. So he very famously, for instance, did experiments that involved the right size shovel for the job, the right size and shape of shovel to be able to do individual tasks. Taylor's work is actually premised upon 3 or 4 quite fundamental underlying assumptions, which is still the bedrock of conventional management theory today. One of those, for instance, is reductionism. So Taylor assumes that if we reduce the work to its constituent components, we can explain the behaviour of the whole. So that's what we do as managers. We should identify and reduce work. Likewise, Taylor also assumes, or Taylorism assumes, the notion of what's called local rationality, which is sort of the flip side of that. By deconstructing work into its constituent components, we can optimize that work. We can manage by local optimum measure. Likewise, Taylor's work is the embodiment of Theory X, as it later became to know through McGregor. Taylor treated the human as an extension of the industrial machinery. Or we've heard the phrase a cog in the machine. Some of you might have seen that classic black and white film, Metropolis, 1927. Fritz Lang, I think, was the director. Where the human being is presented as a person who just pulls the lever and pushes the knob, and that's what we reduced to through Taylorism. It was actually Metropolis was actually a kickback against that work of Taylorism, as embodied in the Ford production system, which is kind of the next major contribution, I suppose, Ford's contribution on mass production. I should say as well that most people attribute the slogan, which I'm sure you've all heard, a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. Most people assume that was a slogan that actually was part of Henry Ford's mass production concept, but actually it was attributable to Taylorism. And what Taylor was trying to get at was that economic reward for the worker should be a function of task completion. So the more work that I do in a day, basically the more reward I will get, the greater my pay. It gives us the notion of piece rate, and so on. And importantly, I should say, before I move on to Ford, one of the important assumptions that underpins scientific management and conventional management theory today is this notion that scale derives efficiency. So for instance, in a factory, the larger the batch size, the better. Associated concepts that come from that line of reasoning are the notion of the economic batch quantity. So we make large batches. When we have to change over for a new batch, the unproductive time as a consequence of setup can be amortized over the batch. So it drives us towards this notion that large batches are a good thing. We're going to see later that all of the comps almost universally reject that logic. Okay? We'll explore that. But it also gives us the notion, associated with that the greater the production volume, the lower the unit cost. And many of the comps challenge that logic as well, we'll see. So Henry Ford, mass production, the great innovation was very much based upon Taylorism. And what Ford's great innovation was as distinct from craft production. Under a craft production system, of course, the one person that's got to be capable of making the whole job must be capable of doing every piece of work. But as a consequence of reductionism and Taylorism, we can deconstruct the job into its constituent parts. We can train the individual to be good at doing one part and get economies as a consequence. And most people assume that the innovation of Henry Ford was, if I ask my students, what's Ford known for? They'd usually tell me that he invented the moving production line, but actually he didn't. Henry Ford, the innovation that was the moving conveyor belt, was actually developed in the mid-1850s. First recorded incident that I've personally seen is in the Union Stockyards in and around Chicago, where these massive new railway network in the US that was capable of bringing up huge quantities of cattle from the breadbasket, the Midwest, up to Chicago, where they would be slaughtered on an industrial scale using an overhead moving conveyor system and then distributed again. So Ford never actually innovated the moving conveyor belt. But of course, it's no good having workers trained to be able to deconstruct the task and having work move past them in the mass production system if we're not capable of, when the work gets there, of putting part A to part B and screwing them together and being assured that they actually work. So the other great innovation that underpins mass production is the notion of interchangeable parts. And that, in turn, was the great exemplar came from the Springfield Armories in the 1860s, where, depending on whether you were American or non-American, if you were American, you would assume that the inventor of the notion of interchangeable parts was Eli Whitney, who also invented the cotton gin in 1800. But actually, it was invented by a French gunsmith called Honor Blanc 2 years beforehand. And what we had was a situation where a musket, in those days, if you took the firing mechanism from, for instance, the stock mechanism from the barrel and fitted three together, they would never work. They were all individually unique. So as a consequence of advances in metallurgy and as a consequence of developments in the notion of interchangeable parts, we can all of a sudden take that trigger mechanism from that musket and put it to that stock mechanism from that musket and be fairly much assured that it's actually going to fire when we press the trigger. So Ford brought all that together. And mass production, I might slip into the use of terms scientific management, mass production, conventional management theory. The whole bundle is what we traditionally teach in schools such as this and propagate in our work. However, and actually before I sort of progress beyond this, again, the usual health warning, no matter how criticised mass production and conventional management theory has been, we must remember that our present standard of living, the fact that we are clothed and equipped the way that we are today, the comfort we live in, certainly in Western society, is a function of the mass production system. But the argument is that mass production is now obsolete. So it was fit for purpose, but it's the features of the contemporary modern production age have made it somewhat less advantageous than alternative approaches. So we must remember that before we launch ourselves into any sort of criticism. But in the modern production age, as I term it, from the mid-1980s onwards, and this is a bit cliche, we see that, sorry, am I moving away from the microphone? We see, for instance, increasingly demanding customer expectations over what our products and services should be. We see, for instance, increasingly shortening product life cycles. We see an increased frequency of disruptive technologies, that have an impact, not just in terms of end product technology, but actually in the production technology of the process itself that produces our products. And we think, I don't know if there's anybody from PDR here, but the potential of 3D printing now, for instance, has the potential to completely disrupt, huge swathes of our manufacturing sector. Think of the impact of the potential of nanotechnology, for instance. And increasingly, there are more frequent and larger disruptive technologies on the horizon. So this modern production age is kind of more challenging, it's more complex and more chaotic than the era from whence these techniques were originally developed, the original era of mass production. And if I was to summarize the dysfunctional characteristics that people complain of, we see, for instance, that as a consequence of the notion that scale drives efficiency, the net effect of that is to drive very large batches of work through the organisations that we work for. I'm thinking it's easy to think of this in terms of manufacturing, but it's equally true in terms of service operations as well. So, large batches of work equate, in the physical sense, to high work in progress. High work in progress effectively is manufacturing lead time in a factory. It equates to time. But the higher the work in progress, the higher the working capital required in order to support that work in progress. And also, the higher the risk of obsolescence. So if you've got a particularly long production process, I was working with John Darlington, who's not here tonight, and Pauline Found from the University of South Wales on a project in Bombardier to make aeroplanes. And this was a major problem for them. There were so many engineering design changes as a consequence of the fast-moving product, or the fast-moving design changes to the product. They were making large batches of work in progress, but large proportions of that inventory, which was very expensive, made of very expensive materials, was becoming obsolete, because we might use one of the 10 that we've produced in a batch, but the other 9 are obsolete before we had a chance to use them. And importantly, bearing in mind that the consumer is increasingly demanding and time precious, one of the other issues with high work in progress, because work in progress is time, is that as a consequence of high work in progress, our production processes become very, very unresponsive to customer demand. Yet another problem or dysfunction with that conventional thinking is that, I'm sure you've heard the term a functional silo or silo structure. Because of the notion of reductionism and task specialization that sits at the heart of mass production and the scientific management approach, etc., there's a tendency to organize into either functional specialisms, like HR, like finance, etc., or even in the production process itself, based around individual processes or work centers. Now, one of the features of a silo structure is that because of the notion of hierarchy, information flows very well up and down those silos, but information doesn't flow very well across them. So we have communication breakdown. And another important feature of them is, because of the notion of local rationality, where we're going to measure and manage according to a local optima, we tend to be very introspective rather than being customer-focused. So I'm sure we've all had the experience where, which my wife will attest, it drives me absolutely crazy. I go into a shop to buy something. I've bought the goods, I've got the goods in my hand, and I've got my money in my other hand, and I'm waiting by the till to pay for my goods. There's 3 or 4 shop assistants there, and all 3 or 4 shop assistants are there busying themselves to tidying the shelves. But I'm standing there with my money in my hand, ready to pay for it for the here and now. It's to lose sight of why we exist as an organisation. I wouldn't say it's the case in this university, but I'm sure whatever university you're in, or whatever organisation you're in, I'm trying to be tactful, we've all had the experience where, for instance, we've had an urgent and important task where we go to our administrative department, and it might be something to do with research, it might be something to do with teaching, it's kind of why we exist in a university, and you try to engage with an administrator you need an answer over, but the administrator is saying, sorry, I can't deal with you now, because actually I've got to prepare a spreadsheet for an exam board in a week's time. It's to defer the importance and priority of now and be introspective, because that's kind of what I get measured against. Okay? So this is the logic of conventional management theory at play, or the criticism of it. We respond to local rationality, and particularly in a bureaucracy, we identify with the paperwork rather than identifying with the needs of the customer, because that's who gives us the money at the end of the day. Another dysfunctional characteristic, of course, is task fragmentation. So in addition to the problems of information flow, the physical work, whether that be a physical product or if you're even in a service environment, is disrupted. Basically, the more functional boundaries that we get, the more boundaries there are to cross. There's a tendency with silo structures and disrupting the flow of work, is that work will queue as it goes across that boundary. It delays. So the total responsiveness of the system as a whole is even lower as a consequence. So basically, the more boundaries we go over, the longer the lead time that we're dealing with. And another related issue, it isn't just the physical flow of work, it's responsibility for the completion of that work. To give a real-life example of that, maybe 10 years ago, we moved into a new house. What always happens in new houses, you have snags. Now, it was all well and good whilst the builders were still on site, because the responsibility for any snags identified was down in the builder's yard. We were around the corner from the builder's yard. So you find a problem with the flooring. It's no problem. You go around the yard, and maybe a day or so later, the builder turns up, and they'll sort the snag out for you. Of course, the problem then happens when they finish building the whole development, and the builders have left. Now, all of a sudden, you find that actually, something I've not noticed before, that wall is a bit loose. It's something major, or as in our case, actually the roof fell off. We came back one day to find that we had this nice sloping roof, and they'd only stuck it in with a 6-inch nail instead of drilling it in with 3 bolts of a 1.5 foot. came back home to find that the whole roof had slipped off, and our neighbour had fortunately seen it and propped it up by a piece of 2x4. Okay? Now, the problem is now, there's no builders there. Whose responsibility is it to sort that out? Now, you're at an awkward time frame. Now, as it turned out, you threaten life and limb, and, you know, the postman could get killed by a stray slate, and sure enough, you know, they turn up rather promptly. But not always the case. We're at that limbo period, you know, of handoff. So, dysfunctional characteristics, which ultimately result in these three performance dimensions. Any system will have quality, cost, and time, and the very thing that we want to expand is the thing that suffers. As a consequence of these issues, performance tends to shrink. So, in response to these sorts of issues, particularly in this modern production age from the 1980s onwards, there's been an increasing rejection in the press, both practitioner and academic, of conventional management theory, mass production, scientific management principles. And we see an equally a growth in comps. I kind of need to define my term for you. I call them comps as a sort of collective noun for these paradigms. Contemporary operations and management paradigms, my own sort of term I tend to use. Operations, because the most influential of them, the likes of Lean, Six Sigma, and theory constraints, have emerged from the operations discipline. And the paradigm element is they represent distinct worldviews, distinct sets of underlying principles, tools, methods, and techniques. And this is not a definitive list, but for instance, and they're kind of in approximate chronological sequence. We've had TOC, the theory constraints. The diagram at the top is alphabet soup, because they tend to come in 2 or 3 letter acronyms, right? So that's kind of where that picture comes from. We've had the theory of constraints. In the UK, almost undoubtedly, my ex-colleague Donna is there and did me a fantastic PhD. I supervised a PhD, and she looked at the diffusion of Lean through the management population. Undoubtedly, in the UK, Lean has been more influential, and these are the sort of seminal publications. We've had time-based competition from Stoke and Hout, efficient consumer response in the grocery industry. Actually, that was originally from Kurt Salmon Associates, even more influential in the UK grocery industry. Hammer and Champy give us business process re-engineering, and Rajan's theory give us quick response logistics. There's at least 3 flavours of Agile that I'm personally familiar with. There's the Agile that came from Lee Iacocca's Institute in the US. There's the Agile school, which exists in Cranfield, which is influential in the supply chain, and there's a flavour of Agile that exists in IT as well that I'm aware of. And more latterly, Six Sigma. And since then, we've also seen hybrids. We've seen Lean Agile, or Leagile, down in Cardiff, and we've seen Lean Sigma. And also, for those of you that might have done some work in the service sector, we see systems thinking. John Seddon's, I think, quite excellent work, which originally was subtitled Lean Applied to the Service Sector. It's quite interesting work. When you actually systematically study them, they virtually all share the same common denominators, and I've attempted to distill it here. They all present themselves as an antidote to those dysfunctions I mentioned earlier. They all present themselves in an holistic system, from an holistic systemic perspective. They all reject reductionism. They say, no, it's wrong. And actually, this is best, I think, captured in this statement or saying from Ellie Goldratt in the book The Goal, which I personally think is the best management book that's ever been written, back in 1984. And he says, a system of local optimums is not an optimum system. Now, that's quite profound. And when I was working with Bombardier, with John Darlington, we actually got the technical solution to trying to improve the flow of their products rather quickly, trying to wean management off the notion that actually you optimize the bottleneck. The bottleneck determines the rate of throughput of a system, as the theory of constraints tells us. But if everybody works flat out and they're not a bottleneck, all you're going to do is you're going to build up work in progress in a factory, right? And that's just going to cost you money. So what that statement is telling us is there are occasions when it's good to stop, right? If you're at the bottleneck, you don't stop. But if you're not at a bottleneck, all you're going to do is cause problems down the line. And for management to swallow that message because of what we teach them and what they believe is very difficult. All of these comps stress teamwork and whole tasking. They all stress the notion of the autonomous work group. Self-directed teams are good. They all attempt to minimize the number of boundaries and handoffs because it reduces the queuing. Right? That's why all contemporary techniques tell us that we should flatten the organization structure. And importantly, I kind of saved the 2 relevant ones to last. All of them, with the possible exception of Six Sigma, stress the need to understand the nature of the customer and what the customer values. Okay? So we need to look externally rather than looking at what's convenient for us and what we measure ourselves against internally. And then once we understand that, we need to maximize the value flow, maximize work velocity through the production system, throughput, call it what you will. And there's a couple of keys to that. This is not definitive. But the key is that if we reduce batch size by half, basically we'll reduce queue time by half, crudely. And also, if we can work at the customer-dictated demand rate into some customer demand signal, that's good too, because that has the effect of reducing work in progress. So, hopefully we see that commonality here, this is obviously where the name value flow comes from. This is my common denominator. What I thought I would do at this stage is very briefly, I know some of you are quite expert in lean, but to try to illustrate a typical paradigm, I was going to very briefly look at the lean paradigm, a couple of slides of this is what lean is, the real basics, and then I was going to try to illustrate that with a project I did a number of years ago, because it's a typical project, just to try to throw a bit more light on this. And the reason for choosing lean is, I believe lean is the archetype. We see the hybrids get defined in relation to lean. Also, it's the most influential, certainly in the UK. Donna's work has shown us that. And also because I kind of know more about lean than I do about any of the others. So I got more examples. Okay. Start with then, lean, actually, the origins of lean are the total production system, designed by a fella called Taiichi Ohno, who designed the total production system, was the architect of it, from the post-war period up to the 80s. And whatever you might or might not know about lean, those of you that have dabbled with it will see it's very rich in tools and techniques. But we mustn't lose sight, at the end of the day, Ohno's original observation behind that system was just, all he was trying to do was eliminate time. Everything else that follows, all the techniques, the techniques that exist out there, are just ultimately to eliminate time. But one of the differences between when he's talking about time and when lean talks about time, as opposed to what we typically teach about time in the business schools, is all of these comps are obsessed with lead time. That's beginning to end time. Whereas us business schools are obsessed with cycle time, which is the individual amounts of time when work is actually happening to the product. Of course, when we look end to end, the proportion of time when work is actually happening is actually a fraction of the total. Okay? So when he's talking about time, he's talking about lead time. And interestingly, Ohno always said you should never codify the system, but he was pushed to put a name on what we now know as the total production system. His original attempt at this was PI, or profitable industrial engineering. Because what Ohno said was, it all equates to money at the end of the day. We really need, from the point of we get a signal from a customer for an order, to the point where we actually get that order to the customer and get the money off them, I kind of basically want to reduce that period of time, right? Because that's going to maximize my cash flow. I was at this stage going to go into a big diatribe about the origins of lean, where the name was, how it was originally going to be called fragile production, etc., etc. But what we need to know is there are only two seminal books really in lean. There was a benchmarking study called the IMVP program, the International Motor Vehicle Program. It was a huge worldwide study that happened in the mid-1980s. And ultimately, it's one of the most contentious academic studies of all time, certainly in business and management. The popularized version of that, effectively, was a great book called The Machine That Changed the World, which I think is either that or The Goal, The Theory of Constraints, is the largest selling management book of all time, I believe. I don't know if, Donna, you did some work in that area, but it's literally hundreds of thousands, okay? And the Machine That Changed the World was all about benchmarking. It says, look at the difference between the best in the game, in this case automotive, and the rest. And it was an order of magnitude difference of performance. So they put the label, those that are the order of magnitude better are lean. Lean was seen as a better adjective than fragile, because you're doing more with less, basically. And then in 1996, Womack and Jones published Lean Thinking, and it sort of said, well, if you realize you've got a problem and you want to do something about it, if you want to realize Ohno's goal of shrinking that time, you should follow these 5 principles. And we can make the observation to start with, hence the value flow. Clearly, the first 2 of the principles are to do with value. Actually, 3 and 4, that's overtly about flow, but actually the pull nature of it is actually about flow as well. So what Womack and Jones tell us is the key to becoming leaner, to be able to compress our times and get all the benefits of being a lean organization, is that we need to understand who our customer is. So it's this notion of extrospective view. We need to focus on the customer, not us. Once we understand who our key customers are, we need to get an in-depth and detailed knowledge of what that customer values. And that needs to be done at a product or product family level. Once we've done that, what we do is we need to then map and reorganize what they call a value stream, or the value delivery process. So understanding what the value delivery steps are of value to that customer. What you want to do, having basically established a picture of what it currently looks like, and a picture of what you'd ideally like it to look like, the future state is going to be informed by maximizing flow. And as we said, we've explored various techniques for making products flow. Ultimately, there are only 4 generic techniques. You can eliminate something. You can do 2 things at the same time or make them concurrent. You can do something at the interface to make 2 things happen at the same time a bit more efficiently. And what's left, you can compress the time. Okay? 4 generic strategies. And once you've managed to make the product flow, the next key step is to do it at a customer-dictated demand rate. Now, in the lean system, the pull mechanism of choice, which achieves basically flow and pull, is a technique called Kanban, which derives from the Japanese word to do with card. And it was the way that the Toyota production system originally did it. So if I buy a product, they buy a car off Toyota, the idea being is that the replenishment order ripples back down. And the card will stop overproduction, which is one of the key wastes. So we don't want to produce too much, right? So we make into order rather than making to forecast. And the Kanban mechanism prevents us from overproducing and facilitates flow. And ultimately, we never let rest on our laurels. We seek perfection. And some of you will be familiar with the Japanese technique of Kaizen, or continuous incremental improvement. Okay? So a prescription of 5 very, very basic principles. If you were to, well, the one word you do need to use, I do think that maybe Ono was born in the Goebbels, because the one word you need to know to understand lean is this notion of muda, means waste. So as in, there's been a muda, as in target, right? I think he was Glaswegian. But in the lean definition, muda is any activity that absorbs resource but doesn't create any value. So we need, but lean is resplendent with lots of Japanese terms. And if you map these things out, you get a footprint, which is the other sort of defining feature of the Lean Thinking book, which this is the footprint of a world-class supply chain, which was actually a 6-pack of Coca-Cola through the Tesco supply chain in the mid to late 1990s. So world-class companies. And one of the features of the lean paradigm is, when you start dealing with these sorts of labels, you know you're dealing with lean. There are only 3 kinds of activity in the lean world. There's value adding, the customer wants to pay for. There's pure waste, which is non-value adding, which you can eliminate immediately with no knock-on effect. And also, there's what they call necessary but non-value adding, or it's wasteful, but we can't remove it now because it will cause damage. So classic examples would be, if I was making a car, value-adding activity is conversion activity, when I'm doing something, cycle time. Non-value-adding activity could be when I take the part, move it to the stores, put it down, come back later, pick it up and move it again. I could have done it once. That's double handling, right? As opposed to an example of necessary but non-value-adding, I can't trust my quality of supply, so I have to have a quality control check now. But ideally, once I've developed the supplier, so I can trust the quality of supply, I can remove that and remove the cost. And because of the sheer size of the target, notice that 95% of that in the world-class supply chain is wasteful. I've got this notion of the sniper. What tends to happen is lean has become associated as a waste reduction methodology because the target is bigger. Also because there was more emphasis placed on waste in the book, right? So the snipers try to go for the body shot rather than the head shot because they might miss. And the work that I've done with Ron and Andrew up there on, we're doing work at the moment on the conception of value tells us it's a very slippery notion, right? So unfortunately, lean's become associated as waste reduction on the belief that waste reduction and cost reduction are the same thing, which they're actually not. But I haven't got time to go into that now. So, steaming onwards, just thought I'd give you a very brief illustration of how this pans out in terms of a project. Very quickly, this was a supply chain project a couple of years back. This is one of 9 or 10 concurrent projects. You tend to get the focal product. 6-pack of pork chops going through the Asda supply chain. This is their key product. The key players in this project were a farmer, food processing abattoir processing plant. That was then packed in a retail packing plant, went through a chill distribution centre, part of Asda, and out through Asda store. Okay? So what you do in a typical lean project, you've got yourself your focal product, you convene yourself a project team, which is truly cross-functional. So you get players from all of those constituencies involved in the team, facilitated by, in this case, myself and 1 or 2 other people. And actually, bear in mind, at this point in time, the farmers were threatening to burn down the distribution centres. So actually get those people in a room was actually quite a task. Well, then everybody maps the whole process through, okay? What follows is looks a bit horrendous for the uninitiated, the non-lean amongst us, but please bear with me on it. So what we do is we've got our team together, and the classic lean approach is mapping, value stream mapping. So we're going to build up a picture with that team of the current state. So we're literally going to walk through the whole process, part at a time, equip them with camcorders, etc. But the key guts of what they're going to do is they, as a team, are going to produce a picture of what it currently looks like. So what you see here is post-it notes. So that might be the colour and the shape for some sort of activity that's a processing activity. Inventory might be a different colour, etc. Okay? And you step through the process. Many of us in this room have done this sort of exercise to death. But I stress that it can actually, in addition to producing a very detailed insight to the practitioner, does now form itself as a useful academic method, because as a sort of structured approach to data collection, it can be incredibly rich. So this particular piece of work, for instance, revealed or produced, say, 22 different maps, 5.5 hours of video footage. I mean, the whole chain was mapped in detail. 350 photographs, etc. You can read it. And 232 issues, which were localized improvement opportunities that we identified. And then you map the future state, and then we're going to do the pictures of how we're going to get there. What follows looks horrendous. I'm just going to give you the main outline of it. I don't expect you to look at all the detail. For the non-lean, this is going to look pretty horrendous, right? What you've got. And over a beer, I shall tell you a very funny story about my colleague Dave Taylor trying to explain this to Richard. Was it Richard Burke, the newscaster? And it was actually quite funny. And Richard was quite abusive towards him, and it was very warranted. It was quite funny. What you've got is, the idea is you get all this onto one page, a piece of paper. And the red bit is the information flow that controls this whole chain. The black bit is the physical flow of the product. That means it's the supplier. That symbol is the customer. And what you get in is the flow. So it's going from the batches of sheep that are going from this farm. You follow them all the way through the abattoir. Basically, the animal's killed. It's broken down into primal form, so big muscle groups. Muscle groups are shipped onto this state-of-the-art cutting plant that was just being commissioned. And they'd stuffed the space-age technology in this place. They were scanning with medical lasers in 3 dimensions. They were thermoforming packaging online. It was quite impressive kit. But that's where they cut the individual pieces of meat into the chop form that actually goes into the trays. It's distributed through the chill distribution centre and out through the store. Okay? These things here are the key data boxes, and it doesn't matter what this means. It's key operational data. Things like our shift changes, quality-related issues, cycle time issues. It doesn't matter for the purpose of this exercise. What we need to understand, and the important point about this was, what we're mapping here is what we call the value line. So this part of the operation took 2 hours. This part of the operation represents 41 hours, etc., etc. This hasn't reproduced particularly well because of the colours, unfortunately. But what this is saying here is that the total lead time, which is quite consistent, and this is a really, really excellent supply chain, from when the herd of animals was taken from the farm to when it manifested itself as chops in little green trays, right, in the Asda stores, was 175.5 hours, of which, if you added up the total amount of time where actually the value-adding element, you know, the pie diagram, the green bit, if you actually added up the total amount of time for each pack of chops where actual work was actually happening, of that 175.5 hours, it was 6 minutes. Right? Now, that's not a criticism of Asda, right? That's normal. A lot of people who have done work like this, we see it again and again and again, okay? So what you do with the team, you build up a picture. So what these green flashes mean, and I'm not going to go through all of them, is that I said these 232 issues, you cluster them and you look for improvement opportunities. So the green ones are short-term improvements. And I think, by definition, that can be done in about 3 months. And so things like put a milk round in place so that you've got controlled transportation between the cutting plant and the individual farmers. Because a farmer could turn up with a truck, or he could have 3 sheep in the back of a jeep, right? So you're taking that under control. And you're doing things like, this is quite interesting, fleece removal. While we were there, in the abattoir, the machine where once they've killed the animal and they take the fleece off, which actually had a residual value, crudely, they've cut the animal. There's like arms that go underneath the fleece, and it's a hydraulic machine, a big hydraulic machine, and it rips it down, and it kind of rips the fleece off in one piece. But whilst we were there observing it, the machine wasn't working properly, and every now and again, approximately every 5 or 6 sheep, there'd be a scream, and a fella from the next workstation down would have to run over, and this thing was about 20 foot high, and it would rip from the bottom up, because the guy that was working the machine would disappear into the air, and the fella next to him had to run and grab him by the ankles and pull him back down again, right? And that was just enough to get the last bit of the fleece off. And I was looking at it, I'm just thinking, the disruption to the flow in the factory was just unbelievable. And I was thinking, I can't believe, I said, how long has that been going on? And they were saying, oh, you know, it's been like that for about 6 months. I said, well, it's just such a no-brainer. You know, why don't you get the machine fixed or get a new machine? So we got a capital expenditure ban in place. But we managed as part of this project to get that. I mean, it was such a no-brainer. It paid for itself in about 6 months. So we had an immediate hit where that machine was replaced, and the process was significantly improved as a consequence. Then we have a series of yellow or medium terms. I think that was like 3 to 6 months. And it's things like improving the chiller capacity, because that was the constraint. It meant investment. The green ones were no capital investment, right? These required some investment. The perfect lamb scheme. It wasn't genetic engineering, but everybody assumed that you know, the lamb is a lamb, and they were trying to breed the lambs so that you had this generic lamb that would be good for pot roasts in the winter and good for burgers in the summer. And they ended up with this scheme where the perfect lamb didn't look like lambs as we know them. It looked a bit like a sausage dog, so that it had a big bum, so that when it was winter time, you know, you could get lots of pot roasts off that. And it was very long in the middle, so it kind of lent itself to a lot of burgers. So they spent a lot of time and energy working on that. It was going to take a bit longer. There were farm assurance schemes and so on and so forth. And then finally, the red ones were, you know, significant capital investment. And one of them was multi-deck haulage to be able to more efficiently transport the lambs in. And they were quite clear that the abattoir infrastructure in the UK is just an historical mess. They are where they are for historical reasons. They're not in a logical place. So there was to toy with the idea of, can we maybe preempt this and have a more logical location of abattoirs throughout the country in relation to the lamb rearing areas? I mean, I could go on ad nauseum about this, okay? But the important point is the last picture, because this was generated by the team, not by us. This was quite the whole team of guys. The point is, it looks like that at the end. Now, I don't need to talk you through it, because the point is, it's clearly much simpler and clearly much neater. And you probably can't see this, but they modelled this, and they suggested that if we were to put all those changes in place, this is what the future state would look like. And we estimated, well, they estimated that instead of it being 175.5 hours, that would go down to 136 hours. That's a saving of over 20%. Now, in terms of the value of the product and the volume of the product, that was absolutely enormous. That would be millions of pounds a year to them. And I can't say they've completed all that agenda, but they have made inroads into it. So that hopefully gives you a flavour of, for those of you that are not familiar with a lean project, of what a lean project looks like. And from the point of view of what comes next, which is the centre, you know, it includes a sort of some of the techniques that we would propose to use in terms of the work that we do, and derivatives of that approach. Which leads me to, I suppose, the concluding part of tonight's lecture, which is to say that, you know, the sort of subject matter I've been exploring today and giving you a very brief overview over, this centre is to be set up, or was actually approved by the Research and Committee meeting on the 1st of October, which is the Value Flow Centre, which is to be existing within the School of Management. And yeah, it's really designed to explore some of these issues in more breadth and more depth. So, this is the vision for the centre. It is, as it says, to become internationally renowned for, well, not just research, by both the practitioner and the academic communities. Now, that's the vision. The shorter-term mission over the 3 to 5 years is that my vision for that, or mission for that, would be that it becomes a very good vehicle for the research assessment exercise in 2020. I very much want those members of staff associated with the centre to have, you know, the requisite quality and quantity of publications to be returnable in REF 2020, and also to be the source of you know, a number of good quality impact studies. Okay, so as a critical mass of individuals, to be a self-contained unit at least that forms a basis for our REF 2020. In terms of differentiation of this centre from other centres that do exist, there's really 3 points of differentiation. Most existing centres tend to focus on one paradigm. I mean, Cardiff was renowned, when we were at Cardiff, Cardiff was all about lean. Latterly, that momentum has moved to Buckingham as some staff have moved. Cranfield, the centre for agile. What this centre will look at is the collective of the most influential comps. So we're not restricting ourselves to any individual one. Another point of difference, I suppose, a differentiation for our centre is the application domain. Again, because of where most of these paradigms came from, they tend to focus on the private sector and particularly manufacturing. Yes, we're interested in that, but we are particularly interested in the public sector and service applications as well, which I think is kind of more interesting personally. But I'm particularly interested in that. And also, a third point of differentiation is, whilst lean and many of these comps came from the operations discipline, I really want our centre, the Value Flow Centre, to have an infusion of marketers and marketing people. And I'm delighted that people like Kath Mutter are here today, and Eileen and Rebecca, and have already expressed an interest. Cranfield, because the agile paradigm has got a good flavour of marketing input. But particularly when you're talking about notions of value, marketing as a discipline is further advanced in operations. And I think it's essential to get that in there. And before we leave this slide, my 3 cogs. I believe that any higher education institution engages in those 3 sets of activities. Research, enterprise and teaching. There's one thing I learned, if I learned nothing else when I was at LERC. LERC Lean Enterprise Research Centre, where I did my formative research and my formative days. LERC was very good at looking for synergies. And it's kind of rubbed off on me. We will not be, I didn't call it a research centre because I want the Value Flow Centre to engage in applied research in particular, but not exclusively. I wanted to engage in knowledge transfer and contract consultancy, and also for that to cross over onto the teaching side of things as well. And ultimately, I'd be looking for synergies between those 3 groups of activities. So for instance, you do applied research, it lends itself to knowledge transfer type work and contract consultancy, and that practical experience can be brought to bear in the classroom. I mean, I work closely with Mike already on business operations and improvement, and we try to bring real life experience into the classroom, and the students enjoy that. They get value out of that. And if you get it right, I think you can get a sort of virtual circle there. So very much the vision is we don't see ourselves only as going to be just about research, but I'm looking for sort of synergistic opportunities. What are we going to research? Well, these are the themes. We're interested, or I'm interested in particular, as are the other guys, with defining anatomy and boundaries of application of these existing comps. Many of them have been criticised as being very theoretical and not bounded effectively. So under what circumstances is it appropriate to try to become lean? And what other circumstances might it be more appropriate to apply a sort of Six Sigma type approach? Actually, very much influenced by Donna's PhD again. More interested in and understanding the diffusion of these paradigms through the management populations. And again, building on work that myself, Ron and Andrew and Hevin have been working on, is understanding the conception of value, because our preliminary work establishes that certainly in the operations discipline, value is a very, very nebulous concept which is ill-defined. Marketing has got further down the road, but actually it's a very, very slippery concept, and there's theoretical work that we're working on. But how do you then operationalise that, what you've learnt? The first lean principle is value from a customer's perspective. But when I give you the mini case, we started from value stream. I think virtually every lean application I've ever been involved with, we never went back to first principles and sort of said, well, who is my customer? What is the customer value? We always start from the second principle of, well, let's start doing some mapping then, is it? So I think there's a practical outlet to this that says, how we can bring tools and techniques to bear to maybe elaborate upon that and do it better. Very much influenced by my work with John Darlington. The management accounting conventions were established in the age of mass production. This is a pretty well-established argument that Kaplan and Johnson have been talking about since the 1980s and many others. But conventional management accounting stands in the face of going down the value flow route. So we need to develop new techniques to support decisions when you reject the notion of the local optima. Okay? And there's ongoing work going, and we'd like to be involved very much with that. Again, the role of information and communication technology. Dan Jones, who was a boss of a few of us, who was as of Womack and Jones, was stridently said in the various books and talks, switch off the computers. Okay? Now, what he was saying was switch off the MRP systems that drive our factories. I don't think he was realistically saying switch off the ERP systems that are so fundamental to modern business. But unfortunately, as a consequence of that message, he was being intentionally simplistic. There's virtually no research about the relationship of information and communication technology and these paradigms, high-performance value flow working. And I see that as an opportunity for our computing department in particular to engage with the agenda of the Value Flow Centre. And also, lastly, I'm kind of really interested in creative problem solving and application methodologies. I'd really like to get back to first principles. So instead of going into organisations and saying, well, do you want to do Lean? Do you want to do Six Sigma? Do you want to do Agile? I'd like to be able to say, well, you know, what's your problem? And let's take it from real first principles. Let's understand and generate ideas. How might we solve that problem? And it might not be operational effectiveness. It might be product development. It might be something else, okay? So that's probably not definitive, but that's the start in themes of the centre. And my last slide is this, which is Value Flow Centre has been about 2 to 3 years in gestation. So we're not, whereas it's just now been approved, thankfully, and I'm really pleased by the university. In the gestation period, we've actually had quite a lot of work. In terms of membership, I'm very pleased that people like Ron and Andrew are here today. But through project work together, through writing pieces, through PhD supervision, what's evolved is a school of thought which is like-minded. And actually, the themes on the previous slide, and not just my themes, it's a collective effort. So we've got a school of thought. We have already self-organised into sort of like almost like publication syndicates. We do a lot of publication work. And what the extended network, and it includes people like Ron and Andrew, but also people like Nick Rich, who's now in Swansea, and the extended network that we already represent effectively a ready-made project consortia to capitalise upon funding opportunities. There's already been some work on the value flow themes with academics certainly in China, Africa, and in Australia through the work in particular that Ron has been doing. And I'm very pleased that people like Mike and Kath are already shown great interest in being a part of the centre. And my vision for the future is that this will become the natural home for our PhD and postdoc students, which will hopefully be aligned with our research agenda. In terms of publication, I tallied up those publications that involved at least 2 of us from our wider external network on the value flow themes, and there's already 3 journal papers, 18 conference papers, and a book chapter in the public domain. And there is 6 journal papers which are in advanced stages. I mean, basically completed drafts are already in peer review, with a lot more behind that, but that's already in place. And 2 conference papers which are work in progress. And for some of you that are members of this university, you'll realise we're also, the stimulus for the centre was the Value Flow University Initiative, where it started we're still in the early days, but it started in July. And we've very kindly given a green light to try and apply some of this thinking to a really meaningful process or value stream, which I think is quite unique. And that is approval of curriculum change. Approval of curriculum change means what's up for grabs here is validation events, minor modification and periodic review, both for home and franchise. Or crudely speaking, that's the product development element of teaching. Now, that's completely different from, there are other existing Lean University type initiatives out there that have gained some traction, but all of them are tinkering around the edges. They're tinkering with I think, peripheral administrative processes. So this gives us a great opportunity to be good corporate citizens and actually to generate good research outcome as well. And finally, the immediate future is the Astute programme of work. Astute 2020 is an all-Wales initiative. Astute 1, I was the principal investigator for Astute 1 when I was at Newport, and PDR ran Astute 1 out of the university here. But it was a £24 million piece of work with in-kind support, 14 million in real money. Astute 2020 is the successor, due to kick off next year, very good chance of money coming through on that, similar order of magnitude again, and basically the Value Flow Centre will be delivering Astute on behalf of the School of Management to parallel with the work that PDR are doing here. And I see that as a great opportunity for us to collaborate with PDR and build some bridges. And the work that comes out of Astute will be fantastic work in terms of impact for Ref 2020, because the nature of the programme is such that you have to generate investment induced and jobs created, and they need to be sanctioned by chief financial officers. So it's going to be great impact material. And hopefully with that agenda as well, hopefully solicit some sort of visiting professor to help me with this expanding remit of what we want to do. But I'm going to talk about that again. It's been very quick. I finished. I was going to give you my favourite analogy for lean, but I'll save that for another day because I think I've slightly overrun. I'm going to be quiet now. Thank you very much for your time.